Hello again. It was perhaps predictable that when Nigel Farage was interviewed recently on the television and said that parts of English cities and towns no longer have a distinctly English flavour, many left-wing types should howl in dismay and accuse him of racism, xenophobia, and various other isms and phobias. None of those people, however, denied that what he said was true. They could hardly have done so, of course, with a straight face. The question is not whether parts of England no longer feel distinctly English, but rather whether you think this a matter for regret. I do, for a reason upon which Farage also touched when he said that many people don't know the names of their neighbours, and he talked about the nature of community. It's perfectly true, of course. A lot of people now living in cities and towns in England don't know the names of their neighbours. Does it matter? I think it does because it leads to the breakup and fragmentation of communities, and there are many ill effects from such a development. Ilford and Seven Kings, where I spent my adolescence and part of my childhood, was at one time a stable and altogether ethnically homogeneous community. The stability meant that people tended to stay in one house for decades on end, and most people in the street knew their neighbours and were often on Christian name terms with them. In Vicarage Lane, where the Plessy factory once stood, my mother's neighbours, those living next door to her, remained unchanged from the late 1950s to the 1980s. That's stability for you. Growing up, everybody in that part of the street knew me by appearance and name, which meant there was a limit to the misbehaviour I could get up to. Adults would not hesitate to tick off children for being rude, dropping litter, or trespassing, say. Since we were familiar with the neighbours, strangers near somebody's house would excite interest, and this acted to discourage housebreaking or vandalism. If the milk wasn't taken in or the curtains remained drawn in the morning, somebody would knock on the neighbour's door to check that they were all right. This kind of concern was associated with knowing people's names, of course. If you saw that Mrs. Bardell at number 72 hadn't taken the milk in one morning, then you felt a personal concern, even though you were not related to her. She was Mrs. Bardell. You knew who she was. She'd been living in that house for 40 years, and everyone knew her. I can assure viewers that this kind of local community was the rule in Seven Kings and Ilford at that time, and also in most other parts of England that I knew of. It's no longer the case. Immigration alone is not, of course, the only, or perhaps even the chief factor for the change, but it's certainly a contributory factor. In those particular parts of East London today, instead of small local communities consisting of the people living in, say, half of one street, areas are composed of separate communities who tend to have little or no dealings with each other, and the members of which change rapidly from year to year. There is a Sikh community in Seven Kings, in a loose sense, in that there are quite a few Sikhs living there, and there are many Muslims now, and these people tend to know each other, but few members of any other ethnicity or religion. There are Hindus who tend to be well off, better off than most people, including white people. And there are also many Eastern Europeans who have moved in recent years, who associate really just with those of their own nationality, Bulgarian or Polish, as the case may be. Often a Polish person, say, living in Vicarage Lane, street that I'm talking about, will have Polish friends coming to see him. He won't have anything to do with the neighbours. If his neighbours are Muslim, he'll barely speak to him. The Polish man's friends will all be Polish people who come in from other areas or other parts of Ilford. So there's no local community at all there. It's Polish people associating with Polish people, just as it's Muslims associating with Muslims. Then, too, many houses are now multiple occupancy with a high turnover of tenants, and it would be very unusual for a Polish person to take any notice of a Muslim or Sikh neighbour, or to know the names of their children. In this way, the old system of community, which benefited children and old people alike and promoted safety for everybody, has unravelled. This is a matter for regret, and it makes life in English towns less pleasant and safe than once it was. I've used Ilford as an example because I have a brother who still lives there, and this has allowed me to compare the area with the way it was in the 1950s and how it is now, over 60 years later. I suspect that many viewers will have similar tales to tell and will know exactly what I'm talking about.